It was a dreary evening in the city, the kind of night when the rain seemed endless, falling in sheets that blurred the streetlights and created pools of water on the sidewalk. Keanu Reeves walked briskly down the quiet street, the sound of his boots tapping against the pavement blending with the distant hum of traffic. He was just finishing up a long day of filming, and all he wanted now was a quick bite to eat and a little peace before heading back to his hotel room. The neon sign of a nearby fast food joint flickered, its inviting glow cutting through the rain. Keanu stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. He ordered a burger and fries, the comforting taste of something simple enough to unwind after a busy day. As he waited for his order, his eyes drifted out the window. That's when he saw him, a young boy, sitting alone on the wet pavement under the shelter of an awning. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, his clothes ragged and his face a picture of exhaustion. A cardboard sign lay next to him, reading, "Anything helps. God bless." The boy held a small, half-eaten sandwich in his hands, his gaze vacant and tired. He didn't look like the typical street kid, there was something almost haunting about him. Keanu felt a pang of sympathy. He knew the city had its fair share of people struggling, but seeing this child, this innocent face, tugged at something deep within him. Without thinking much, Keanu grabbed his meal and walked out the door, stepping into the rain-soaked street. As he approached, the boy didn't even look up. Keanu paused for a moment, then crouched down to his level. "Hey there," Keanu said gently, offering a small smile. "You okay?" The boy's eyes flickered up for a second, then dropped back to the sandwich in his hands. He hesitated before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't eat that." Keanu blinked, taken aback. "What?" he asked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He chuckled softly, thinking it was just the ramblings of a tired, hungry child. "Don't eat that," the boy repeated, this time looking Keanu directly in the eye. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something far too knowing for a child his age. Keanu's smile faltered. "Why not?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light, though he couldn't shake the odd feeling creeping up his spine. The boy's expression didn't change, but he lowered his voice even further, as if sharing a secret. "If you eat it, something will change. Something bad." Keanu felt a chill run through him. The city was full of strange characters, sure, but there was something about this kid that seemed different. The words lingered in the air, heavy and cryptic. He stood there for a moment, looking at the boy, then glanced down at his food, still warm in his hands. The streets were bustling, the rain steady, but for some reason, everything around him seemed to fade. He felt as though he was standing at the edge of something he didn't fully understand. Keanu didn't know why, but he found himself asking, "What do you mean by that? What's going to happen?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at Keanu with those eyes that seemed far too old for someone so young, before turning his gaze back to the sandwich. He didn't need to say more. There was a weight in the silence that felt too deep to ignore. Keanu stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Was this just a random encounter with a troubled kid, or was there something more to it? Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was important. As he turned to leave, the boy's voice stopped him. "Be careful," the boy whispered, almost too quietly to hear. Keanu glanced back, his heart pounding slightly faster. The boy had already returned to staring at the wet pavement, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Keanu walked away, but his mind was racing. "Don't eat that." The phrase echoed in his head as he made his way down the street, trying to push it aside, but something about it stuck with him. It wasn't just the boy's words, it was the way he said it, the urgency, the certainty in his tone. And for the first time that night, Keanu wondered if he had just stumbled into something far bigger than a simple street encounter. Something that, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt like it was going to change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, he imagined a voice saying, though he wasn't sure why. It was almost as though the scene had a strange pull, like a story waiting to unfold. As Keanu made his way through the rain-soaked streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's words would follow him. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu thought to himself, unsure if he was asking the question to himself or to someone else. But something deep inside told him that this was just the beginning of something he couldn't yet comprehend. What had the boy meant? And why did he feel like this was only the start of a much bigger story? The only thing Keanu knew for sure was that he couldn't ignore it. Not now. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's warning wasn't just a random bit of street wisdom. As he walked back to his hotel room, the rain continued to fall, but there was something different about the way he saw the world now. The city, usually so familiar and comforting, felt foreign, almost like it was hiding something just beneath its surface. Something he wasn't supposed to see, or perhaps something he was meant to find. He arrived at his hotel and tried to shake off the encounter, brushing it off as one of those strange, fleeting moments that come and go in a busy city. But the boy's words kept playing in his mind, like an annoying song that wouldn't leave his head. "Don't eat that." The phrase haunted him, especially because it wasn't just a warning, it was a prediction, an unsettling certainty in the child's voice that didn't feel like something a homeless kid should know. Keanu tried to relax, watching a few shows on TV to distract himself, but his thoughts kept wandering back to the boy on the street. What did he mean by something bad? And why did he look so serious, so certain? The boy couldn't have been older than 12, but his eyes had carried a weight that felt far beyond his years. The next morning, Keanu couldn't help himself. He had to go back to the spot where he'd seen the boy, hoping to get some answers, or at least some closure. He didn't expect to find much, but something inside him told him that he wasn't done with this encounter yet. The streets were still wet from last night's rain as Keanu walked toward the alley where he had seen the boy. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, and as he turned the corner, he scanned the area, hoping to spot the child. But there was no sign of him. Keanu felt a pang of disappointment. Maybe the kid was just another face in the crowd, a brief interaction that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. As he stood there for a moment, considering leaving, he heard a soft voice from behind him. "You came back." Keanu turned to find the boy standing in the same spot as the night before, his small frame almost hidden beneath a large, worn-out coat. His face was serious, and there was a strange sense of urgency in his eyes. "Yeah, I had to," Keanu said, taking a cautious step toward him. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said." The boy didn't smile, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come back," he replied, his voice low and raspy. "Why?" Keanu asked, his curiosity piqued. "What's going on? What's so dangerous about that sandwich?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. "It's not just the sandwich. It's everything around it. You're not the first to ask. But people don't listen. They think it's all just coincidence, but it's not." Keanu furrowed his brow. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" The boy looked around, as if to make sure no one else was listening, then took a deep breath. "There's a group. They're watching, always watching. They've been doing things, experiments. With food. With people. But nobody knows what it really does until it's too late." Keanu's mind raced. "What kind of experiments? What do you mean by it?" The boy's gaze shifted to the ground, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to control people, change them. The food, it's part of it. It's not just for nourishment. It does things to you. Makes you see things, makes you think things that aren't real." Keanu shook his head. "That doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? What does any of this have to do with that sandwich?" The boy looked at him then, his eyes locking onto Keanu's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. That sandwich is part of the plan. It's a test. They're using people like you, people who don't see what's coming. They'll get to you. It's all connected. Keanu felt a knot form in his stomach. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. A group experimenting with food, controlling people's minds? It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. But there was something about the boy's tone, his certainty, that made Keanu hesitate. What if the kid wasn't just a troubled soul making things up? What if there was truth to his words? So what am I supposed to do about it? Keanu asked, his voice steady but filled with confusion. The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around again, then took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. There's a place. A warehouse on the edge of town. That's where it all happens. If you really want to know the truth, that's where you need to go. Keanu stared at him, trying to process everything. A warehouse? A secret operation? Was he seriously considering following a homeless child's cryptic instructions? But there was something in the boy's eyes that convinced him this wasn't some wild fantasy. Are you sure about this? Keanu asked. What's going to happen there? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he simply turned away, walking toward the alley's darkened end. You'll find out soon enough, he said over his shoulder. Keanu stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing with questions. Was this some kind of joke? Or was he being dragged into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined? He had a choice to make. He could walk away, forget the whole thing, and chalk it up to a weird encounter. Or he could follow this strange lead, trust the boy's words, and see where it took him. Without realizing it, Keanu found himself already making the decision. He turned and started walking toward the edge of town. Something told him that this journey wasn't over yet, and it was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Keanu's footsteps echoed through the damp streets as he made his way to the outskirts of the city. He hadn't planned on being dragged into something like this, but something about the boy's words had struck a chord deep within him. The whole situation felt absurd, yet somehow, it made sense. There was a kind of conviction in the child's voice that Keanu couldn't ignore. The city seemed to change as he walked further away from the bustling center. The streets became quieter, less populated, the buildings taller and more industrial, their windows dark and empty. A sense of unease began to settle over him. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but one thing was certain, he couldn't turn back now. Keanu glanced at his watch. It was late, but the streets around him were strangely deserted. He passed a few rundown shops, their neon signs flickering weakly in the mist. The further he walked, the more he wondered if he was on the right path, or if he had somehow let himself get swept into something dangerous, something beyond his control. As he reached the outskirts of town, the buildings grew more isolated, and the streets turned into narrow alleys. Keanu checked the address the boy had whispered to him, a nondescript part of town that barely showed up on a map. He stood at a corner, scanning the surroundings. Finally, in the distance, Keanu spotted what he was looking for, a massive, dilapidated warehouse, standing alone amidst a field of weeds and broken pavement. The place was dark, but he could make out faint flickers of light inside. His heart began to race. Was this really it? Keanu hesitated for a moment, standing across the street, eyeing the building. It was a long way from the safety of the city, and the unease in his gut only grew. His instincts told him to turn around, to walk away, but another part of him, one that had been sparked by the boy's cryptic words, pushed him forward. What if this was the key to something bigger? Something more than just a weird encounter on the street? Taking a deep breath, Keanu crossed the street, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the warehouse. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and rust. He pushed open the creaky door, and the hinges groaned in protest, but no one seemed to notice. Inside was a large, empty room, the walls covered in grime, and the air thick with dust. The flickering lights above cast eerie shadows on the concrete floor. He took a step forward, his eyes scanning the space. The warehouse seemed deserted, but Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. A cold draft moved through the room, sending a shiver down his spine. "Hello?" Keanu's voice echoed, but there was no answer. He walked deeper into the building, his footsteps barely audible over the hum of the lights. The room was vast, stretching far beyond what he could see, and as he moved, he noticed a series of old, rusty containers stacked in the far corner. Something about them didn't sit right with him. Suddenly, he heard a noise, a rustling sound coming from the shadows at the far end of the warehouse. Keanu froze, instinctively reaching for his phone, but before he could pull it out, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was the boy. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a mixture of relief and confusion. The boy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply looked up at Keanu with that same, intense gaze, his eyes shadowed by the dim light. "I told you not to come," he muttered, his voice sounding more serious than before. "You're not supposed to be here." Keanu's frustration began to mount. "You brought me here. You told me to come." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "What is all this? What are you trying to get me into?" The boy's face softened slightly, as if he were trying to figure out how much to reveal. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. "They've been using this place for experiments. But they don't want people to know. They want it all to stay hidden." Keanu took another step closer, his curiosity burning. "What kind of experiments? What's going on here?" The boy finally spoke again, but his words were cryptic. "It's not just food. It's about control, about changing people from the inside out. They're testing something that makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. They've been doing it for years, and now they're getting closer to their goal." Keanu's heart raced as he tried to process what the boy was saying. "Are you telling me that this place is, what? Some kind of mind control lab?" The boy nodded, a somber look on his face. "Something like that. But it's not just about controlling people's minds. It's about controlling their entire being. Changing them. They think they can make the world better by turning people into something they can control. But the truth is, it's dangerous. And if you keep eating the food, it's going to change you too." Keanu felt his stomach twist. The food, he realized then that the boy wasn't just talking about a sandwich. It was bigger than that. Everything he had heard, every warning the boy had given him, pointed to one terrifying truth: there was something much darker going on here, something that even Keanu, with all his experience in the film industry, wasn't prepared for. "Why me?" Keanu asked. "Why bring me into this? What do you want from me?" The boy stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you're the one who didn't walk away. You came back. And now it's too late. You're part of this now." Keanu swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what he had gotten himself into, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't back out now. He had to find out what was happening, even if it meant facing whatever dangers lay ahead. A sudden, harsh light flashed from the far corner of the warehouse, and Keanu spun around. There was movement in the shadows, footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Someone was coming. The boy grabbed his arm. "They're here. We have to go. Now." Keanu's pulse quickened as he looked back at the door, realizing that escape might not be so easy after all. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as the boy tugged on his arm, pulling him away from the advancing lights in the distance. The sudden realization that they weren't alone in the warehouse sent a cold wave of fear through him. He tried to focus, to think clearly, but the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly before him only made everything feel more suffocating. "They can't catch us if we're quick," the boy muttered, his voice sharp with urgency. He didn't wait for Keanu to respond but darted toward the back of the warehouse, weaving between the rusted containers. Keanu hesitated for a split second, but then the sound of footsteps and voices grew louder. Someone was definitely coming. He had no choice but to follow the boy. They moved through the maze of towering crates, each step taken with caution. The flickering lights above cast erratic shadows on the concrete floor, making the space feel alive with movement. Keanu's mind was spinning, still trying to make sense of what was happening. Mind control? A secret experiment? It felt like something out of a thriller, but this was real, too real. The boy suddenly stopped in front of a door, hidden behind a stack of crates. Keanu nearly crashed into him as he jerked to a halt. "Here. This way," the boy said, his voice barely audible as he shoved the door open. It creaked loudly, and Keanu winced, hoping no one had heard. But the boy didn't seem to care. He slipped through the doorway quickly, and Keanu followed. They were in a narrow corridor now, with low ceilings and the faint smell of mildew in the air. The boy moved fast, leading Keanu down the hallway and around a sharp corner. Every step felt heavier than the last as Keanu tried to keep his breathing steady. "Where are we going?" Keanu whispered, trying not to make too much noise. The boy didn't answer right away, but his pace quickened. "We need to get to the back exit. There's a van waiting for us," he said finally, his voice tight with anxiety. "They'll be looking for us. We can't let them catch us now." Keanu didn't ask who they were, he was too focused on getting out alive. The boy clearly knew the layout of the warehouse better than anyone, moving through the winding hallways with ease. Keanu, on the other hand, was already starting to feel the weight of panic pressing down on him. The sound of footsteps came again, louder now, echoing in the narrow hall. Keanu's pulse quickened, and he instinctively pressed himself closer to the wall, hoping the shadows would conceal them. He could feel the boy's breath quicken too, the tension in the air growing thicker. "We can't let them find us," the boy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they catch us, they'll make sure you're part of the experiment. It'll be too late." Keanu felt a jolt of panic. "What do you mean? What's going to happen to me?" "They change you," the boy said, his voice full of quiet fear. "They'll put something in your head, something that makes you do things you don't want to do. You won't be yourself anymore. That's what they want. They control everything. Your mind, your body." Keanu's stomach turned. This was insane. Every part of him told him to walk away, to leave the kid behind and escape. But he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut. This was more than just some random conspiracy theory. There was something dark and twisted going on here, and it involved more than just food. It was about power, control. They rounded another corner, and Keanu felt a rush of relief as they reached a door at the far end of the corridor. The boy reached for the handle, but just as his fingers touched it, a voice rang out from the other side. "Stop right there." Keanu froze, his blood running cold. His first instinct was to run, but the boy was already pulling him back into the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Keanu could hear the distinct sound of more people approaching. "There's no time," the boy whispered urgently. "We have to go. Now." Without thinking, Keanu grabbed the boy's arm and pulled him toward the nearest exit, an old, rusted fire escape ladder on the side of the building. It was their only chance. The voices behind them were getting closer, and Keanu's heart raced as he scrambled up the ladder with the boy hot on his heels. The metal rungs felt cold and slippery under his hands, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. They reached the top, where Keanu pushed open a small hatch and emerged onto the rooftop. The cold night air hit his face like a slap, but it felt like a breath of freedom after the claustrophobic panic inside. Keanu turned to the boy, his chest heaving with adrenaline. What now? The boy didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. There was no time to waste. There's a van, the boy said, pointing to a narrow alleyway across the street. It's waiting for us there. We'll be safe if we make it there in time. Keanu nodded quickly, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. They had no time to waste. Every second felt like it could be their last. They sprinted across the rooftop, jumping over vents and dodging low-hanging pipes. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them as the people from the warehouse began to spill out into the streets below. Keep going, the boy urged, his voice sharp. They reached the edge of the rooftop and jumped down into the alley. Keanu hit the ground hard but pushed himself up quickly, scanning for the van. And then he saw it, an old white van, parked in the shadows, its engine running. They ran toward it, but just as they reached the van, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Keanu froze, his heart sinking into his stomach. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark clothes, and he had an air of authority that made Keanu's blood run cold. This wasn't just some random person on the street. This man was part of it. Not so fast, the man said, his voice low and menacing. Keanu's mind raced. This was it. He had to make a choice, fight, or risk everything and run. The boy pulled on his arm, urging him toward the van. Get in, he hissed. Keanu didn't hesitate. He shoved past the man and climbed into the van, pulling the door shut behind him. The van screeched into motion, and Keanu glanced out the back window just in time to see the man step forward, his hand reaching for something at his side. Then, everything went black. Keanu's head was spinning. The world outside the van was a blur as it sped down narrow streets, the hum of the engine mingling with his thoughts, which raced faster than the wheels beneath him. His body felt like it was still back in that warehouse, trapped in the shadows of fear and uncertainty. But the boy beside him remained calm, staring out the window, his face a mask of concentration. Keanu tried to make sense of everything that had happened, how he had been pulled into something far beyond the realm of anything he knew. None of this felt real. Mind control, secret experiments, and a homeless child speaking with an eerie sense of authority? This wasn't a plot for a movie. This was his life now. He glanced over at the boy, who seemed completely unfazed by everything. Where are we going? Keanu asked, his voice quieter now. There was a new edge to his tone, an edge that came from fear, but also from the need to understand. He had to know more. What had he gotten himself into? The boy didn't turn to look at him. To a safe house, he replied softly. You'll be safe there. For now. Keanu furrowed his brow. Safe house? From what exactly? His voice tightened with frustration. What's really going on here? The boy's gaze flickered briefly to Keanu, then back to the dark road ahead. He sighed, as if the weight of all the answers was too much to bear. It's not just about the food, he said quietly. It's about control. They've been testing on people for years, altering their minds, manipulating their thoughts, their actions. The food is just the beginning. Keanu's stomach twisted. And I'm part of this now. The boy nodded slowly, but his expression remained hard. Once they've targeted someone, it's hard to walk away. Trust me, I've tried. The only way to stop it is to find out who's behind it all, and why they're doing it. Keanu leaned back in his seat, processing the words. Every part of him wanted to deny it, to convince himself that this was just some delusion, some odd series of events that would fade away once the fog of fear cleared. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't a movie. This was happening. The van slowed as they turned into a quiet residential area, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The houses here were older, their yards overgrown with weeds, some even abandoned, their windows boarded up. The kind of place where secrets were hidden, secrets people didn't want to be found. "Here," the boy said, breaking the silence. He pointed toward a small, dilapidated house at the end of the street. "This is where we'll be safe for now." Keanu's eyes scanned the house as the van pulled up and stopped in front of the weathered building. The windows were dark, the porch steps creaked with age, and the paint on the walls had long since chipped away. Nothing about this place screamed safe, but in a world where nothing made sense, it was the best option they had. The van engine turned off, and the boy swung open the door, hopping out before Keanu had a chance to react. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was getting into, but then he climbed out after him, his mind still racing. The boy led him up to the porch and knocked 3 times on the door. Keanu stood back, eyeing the surroundings, his senses on high alert. Was this really safe? Were they walking into a trap? The door creaked open slowly, and an older woman appeared in the doorway. She looked to be in her late 50s, her face worn by years of hardship, but her eyes held a quiet strength. She studied Keanu for a moment before turning to the boy with a small nod. "Is he with you?" she asked, her voice gravelly. The boy nodded. "He's one of us now." The woman didn't say anything more. She simply stepped aside, letting them both enter. As they crossed the threshold, Keanu noticed how different this house felt. It was still worn, but there was a warmth to it, an atmosphere of resilience. There were pictures on the walls, scattered papers on the tables, and an old, comfortable-looking couch in the living room. It didn't feel like a hideout, but rather a place that had seen more than its fair share of battles and survived. "This is Mrs. Monroe," the boy said, introducing the woman. "She's been helping people like us for a long time." Keanu offered a tight smile, but his mind was still elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he knew, everything he thought he understood, was being turned upside down. Mrs. Monroe gave him a warm smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "It's a lot to take in, I know. But you're not alone now. We've all been where you are." Keanu glanced at the boy, who was now sitting on the couch, his arms folded. "You've been doing this for a long time?" Keanu asked, unsure of how to phrase his next question. "How do you know all of this? About the food, the experiments, the control?" Mrs. Monroe sat down at the kitchen table and sighed. "We've been watching them for years. They've been running their operation under the radar, using people for their experiments, feeding them things they didn't know were dangerous. And it's not just food. It's mind manipulation. They've been testing drugs, psychological control techniques, all sorts of things." Keanu shook his head in disbelief. "But why me? Why did they target me?" The boy spoke up from the couch, his voice unusually calm. "Because they saw potential in you. They always go after the ones who won't be easy to control. The ones who have something to fight for." Keanu's throat tightened. "You mean I'm a test subject?" Mrs. Monroe nodded slowly. "Yes. But that doesn't mean it's over. You still have control. If we can find the right people, the ones who know how to fight this, we can stop them before it's too late." Keanu's mind swirled with questions, but one thing stood out among the chaos: he wasn't alone anymore. He had a chance to do something. To stop this before it could go any further. It was then that Keanu realized that the real battle was just beginning. He wasn't just going to fight for himself. He was going to fight for everyone who had been caught in this web of control. And he wasn't going to stop until he had answers. Keanu couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the chaos of the past few hours rushed back to him. The warehouse, the boy, the terrifying glimpse into a world that felt so far removed from everything he knew. He tossed and turned on the worn-out mattress Mrs. Monroe had given him in a spare room at the back of the house. The only sound that kept him company was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards above. His thoughts spiraled. What had he really gotten into? Was there any hope of escaping it? And who exactly were they? These questions buzzed around his head, relentless and unyielding, as though there was some hidden truth just out of reach. His mind kept going back to the boy, the one who seemed to know more about what was going on than anyone else. He had said he tried to escape. But what had happened to him before? What made him so sure that they could stop the experiments, that they could fight back? Suddenly, Keanu sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. A thought had struck him, sharp and sudden. The boy wasn't just a random street kid. He knew too much. And if he knew all of that, he had to have been involved in something before. Keanu swung his legs over the side of the bed, pulling himself up. He walked to the window and peered outside. The night was quiet, the moon hanging high above, casting pale light over the rundown houses. The street was empty, save for the occasional stray cat or rustling of leaves. Keanu's hand tightened on the window frame. He had to know more. And the boy, though clearly keeping his distance, had to be the key to unlocking whatever was going on. Without another thought, Keanu slipped out of the room and quietly made his way toward the living room. Mrs. Monroe was likely asleep, and he needed to find answers before the boy slipped out of his grasp again. He had a feeling the answers wouldn't just be handed to him, they would have to be coaxed out. As he entered the living room, the boy was there, sitting on the couch again, his expression unreadable in the dim light. A notebook lay open on the coffee table in front of him, scribbled with notes and diagrams. Keanu had never seen the boy write anything down before, and he couldn't help but be curious about what was inside the notebook. "Can we talk?" Keanu asked, his voice quieter than usual. The boy didn't look up. Instead, he closed the notebook, his fingers pressing it shut. He gave Keanu a sidelong glance before speaking. "You can ask, but I'm not sure you'll like the answers." Keanu stood there for a moment, unsure of how to approach him. The boy had been guarded from the moment they met, and it was clear that trust was a hard thing to come by in this world they now found themselves in. "I need to understand," Keanu said finally, his voice steady. "I need to know who you are and why you're helping me. Why all of this matters." The boy hesitated for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "I told you before. I tried to get out. I thought I could outrun it, that I could forget. But they found me again. They always find you." Keanu walked closer, his voice becoming more insistent. "Who are they? What exactly are they doing?" The boy's eyes flickered to the notebook, and for a brief second, Keanu saw something in them, pain, regret, and a hint of fear. "I was part of their experiment," he said quietly. "I didn't know what they were really doing at first. I thought it was just food, just something to help people, keep them alive. But then I started to notice things." He looked up at Keanu, his gaze sharp. People were changing. They were becoming different. They were being controlled. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "Controlled how?" The boy's hands shook as he spoke. "They used food, yes. But it wasn't just the food. They laced it with drugs, psychotropic substances that rewired people's brains. And the worst part is that they didn't need to be physically present to control you. They used frequencies, pulses, waves sent through their communications, their signals, to control thoughts, emotions, actions." Keanu stepped back, his mind reeling. This was bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. "So, they've been using mind control all along? And you're telling me I've been exposed to it?" The boy nodded grimly. "Yes. You've been targeted. It's why you're here, why they came after you. They know that you're resistant. It's the only reason I could make it out, because I resisted long enough for them to give up on me for a while." Keanu tried to process what the boy had said, but it was like trying to make sense of a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces didn't fit. Mind control? Drugs in the food? It sounded like science fiction, but the evidence was right in front of him. The boy was living proof. I didn't ask for this, Keanu said, more to himself than to the boy. I didn't ask to be part of this. The boy's gaze softened for a moment, but he quickly hardened again. None of us did. But it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we do now. Keanu nodded slowly, understanding that the stakes were higher than he had thought. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about stopping something that had the potential to change the world, or destroy it. How do we stop them? Keanu asked, determined now more than ever. Is there anyone who can help us? The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the notebook on the table and opened it, showing Keanu a map, marked with different locations, some in red, others in black, a series of codes and symbols that Keanu didn't recognize. This is where it all started, the boy said. The headquarters. The main facility. We have to go there, break in, and find out who's really behind it. Once we get the evidence, we can expose them. Keanu stared at the map, his stomach twisting with unease. It was dangerous, more dangerous than anything he had ever done. But there was no turning back now. I'm in, Keanu said, his voice firm with resolve. The boy nodded, and for the first time, a small glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. We're not just fighting for our freedom. We're fighting for everyone who's been taken, the boy said quietly. And we won't stop until we've taken them down. Keanu exhaled deeply, the weight of the decision settling in. There was no turning back. They were going after the heart of the operation. And he was ready for whatever came next. The war had only just begun. Keanu's mind was running a mile a minute as he and the boy, whose name still hadn't been revealed, stood together in the dark living room of Mrs. Monroe's house. The boy had handed him the map, and Keanu studied the tangled network of lines, codes, and red markings with a growing sense of urgency. The headquarters. The main facility. They were only a few steps away from the truth, or a few steps into something that could completely tear their world apart. The boy stood by the window, his back to Keanu. You don't have to do this, he said, the words laced with hesitation. It's dangerous. There's no turning back once we go in. Keanu didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. The uncertainty had already taken root in his heart, but it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about stopping whatever was happening to people, to him, before it spread even further. I'm in, Keanu repeated, the words solidifying the commitment. There was no going back now. The boy turned, his expression unreadable. We leave first thing in the morning. We'll need to move fast, and we'll need to be quiet. The last thing we want is to draw attention to ourselves. It's going to be a long journey. Keanu nodded and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what to expect and they arrived at the facility, but one thing was clear, it wouldn't be easy. He had seen enough to know that they weren't dealing with an ordinary operation. This was something much more sinister, and whoever was behind it would do anything to protect their secrets. The night passed slowly. Keanu lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything he had learned. The boy's words echoed in his mind, they're controlling people. Manipulating their thoughts, their actions. The fear, the anger, it all started to settle in. But it was more than that. It was a determination, a need to take control of his own fate, to stop being a puppet in someone else's game. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, Keanu was up. He pulled on his jacket, checking his bag one last time to make sure he had everything he might need, a flashlight, some basic supplies, and the map. Mrs. Monroe had prepared a quick breakfast for them, some bread and fruit, before they left. The air in the kitchen felt heavy with unspoken words, as if everyone knew the gravity of what was about to happen. Be careful, Mrs. Monroe said softly, her eyes filled with concern as she handed Keanu a small, worn key. "You might not be able to come back. Not the same, at least." Keanu took the key from her, giving her a brief nod. "We'll be careful. We'll be back." The boy, who had been silent since dawn, stepped toward the door. "Ready?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Keanu looked at him for a long moment. This wasn't just some adventure anymore. This wasn't just about fighting an unseen enemy. This was personal. He met the boy's eyes. "Yeah. Let's do this." The drive was long and uneventful, the streets empty as the van rolled through them, its tires humming quietly against the asphalt. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts constantly shifting between the unknowns of the mission and the growing anxiety in his chest. The silence between him and the boy was a heavy one, filled with anticipation and the unspoken knowledge that they were heading straight into danger. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of a heavily guarded area. As they neared the facility's perimeter, the boy gave a single, subtle motion for Keanu to stop the van. They were still a few miles away, but it was clear that getting closer would only put them at risk. "From here, we go on foot," the boy said quietly, his eyes scanning the area. "The place is surrounded by cameras and guards. We'll need to be quick." Keanu nodded, his nerves sharpening. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. The moment where everything could change. They grabbed their bags and moved silently, slipping through alleyways and back streets, carefully avoiding the main roads and any potential surveillance. The boy led the way, confident in his every move, as though he had done this before. Eventually, they came to a large fence that bordered the facility. It was tall and reinforced, with barbed wire lining the top. Keanu's heart was racing as he looked up at it. It seemed impenetrable, but the boy didn't hesitate. "This way," he whispered, pointing to a small section of the fence where the wires had been cut, allowing for a narrow gap. Keanu followed the boy through the gap, squeezing through the hole with only inches to spare on either side. Once they were through, they crouched low, moving swiftly toward a small building near the back of the complex. The boy stopped, holding up a hand to signal Keanu to be quiet. They were close now. Keanu's eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of guards or cameras, but it was eerily silent. His breath caught in his throat as they reached the building, crouching down behind a stack of crates. The boy looked up at the building's security cameras. "We'll need to disable them," the boy said, pulling something from his bag. "A small EMP device should do the trick." Keanu glanced at him, feeling a wave of disbelief. "You brought an EMP?" The boy gave a small, grim smile. "I'm prepared." The boy set the device against the base of the camera and pushed a button. A small flash of light blinked, followed by a soft whirring sound as the cameras powered down. "We're in," the boy said, leading the way to the door of the building. Keanu's pulse quickened. This was it. They were inside. Every step they took felt like a countdown to something big. He didn't know what they would find once they got to the heart of the operation, but one thing was clear: they had to find the answers, or they would never be free. With a final deep breath, Keanu followed the boy into the building, knowing that whatever lay ahead, there was no turning back now. The air inside the building was thick with a damp, metallic scent. The dim lights above flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. Keanu could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, each step echoing through the hollow space. The boy moved quickly, darting from shadow to shadow, barely making a sound. Keanu, trying to keep up, felt the gravity of the situation sink deeper with every passing moment. The fear in his chest seemed to tighten around his lungs, but he pushed it down. There was no time for hesitation now. They moved down a long hallway, each door they passed locked and unmarked, a maze of uncertainty. The boy didn't say much, his expression focused and intense, but Keanu could sense that he was just as on edge as he was. This wasn't a place for mistakes. One wrong move, and they'd be caught. And the consequences? He shuddered to think about it. Eventually, the boy stopped in front of a large metal door at the end of the hallway. The door was different from the others, heavier, reinforced, with a keypad beside it. The boy quickly pulled out a small device from his bag. Keanu watched as he connected it to the keypad, his fingers working fast. The device hummed briefly before the door clicked open. "This is it," the boy said quietly, glancing over at Keanu. His face was set, his eyes filled with the same determination Keanu had seen in them since they first met. "We're about to find everything." Keanu felt a surge of nervous energy. This was the heart of the operation. They had made it this far, but what they found inside could change everything. The boy pushed open the door, and they stepped into the room. Inside, rows of computers lined the walls, all displaying streams of data, coded messages, surveillance footage, and charts that made no sense to Keanu at first glance. The room hummed with the sound of machinery working, a sharp contrast to the dead silence outside. In the center of the room stood a large table, cluttered with papers, files, and more of the strange diagrams Keanu had seen before. The boy moved to the table, rifling through the papers. "This is it," he said, pulling out a large file. He opened it, revealing more intricate details than Keanu had ever imagined. The files were filled with names, dates, and numbers, but what caught Keanu's attention were the photographs of people he didn't recognize. But the expressions in their eyes, there was something familiar about them. They were the same eyes the boy had. "They've been experimenting on people," Keanu said, his voice barely a whisper. His hand shook slightly as he flipped through the pages. "These people, they were all part of it?" The boy didn't answer right away. He was staring at the photos with a quiet intensity, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he spoke, his voice strained. "Yes. I was one of them. These people, they were like me. They were all chosen because they showed a certain resistance. They had something they wanted. Something that could stop the control they were using." Keanu swallowed hard. His thoughts were racing. It was one thing to hear about the mind control, but seeing the photos, hearing it from someone who had been through it, it was an entirely different thing. It made the whole situation feel even more real, more dangerous. "They've been testing something on us," the boy continued. "They wanted to find out how much they could push someone before they broke. They wanted to know how far they could go to control us. To break our wills and make us obedient. They were looking for people who could resist their control long enough to get the data they needed." Keanu felt his stomach turn. This wasn't just some corporate greed. This was something darker, more twisted. People had been used as experiments. And the boy? He was one of the survivors. One of the few who had managed to escape the experiments. The boy paused, his eyes narrowing on a series of files that seemed more recent. "These ones," he murmured, reaching for them. Keanu watched as the boy carefully picked through the papers, his face darkening with each document he scanned. "What is it?" Keanu asked, his heart racing. Something had shifted in the boy's demeanor. He was tense, almost afraid. "They're still doing it," the boy said quietly, his voice heavy with disbelief. "They're still experimenting. And now they've moved on to something worse. They're not just controlling minds anymore. They're trying to manipulate DNA." Keanu froze. "What do you mean, manipulate DNA?" The boy looked at him, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and realization. "They're trying to create something new. Something they can control from birth. A whole army of people who will do whatever they say. No resistance. No free will." Keanu shook his head, trying to process the weight of what the boy was saying. "An army? It seemed impossible. But when he thought back to the reports, to the signs of mind control, it started to make sense. They were trying to create the perfect soldiers, people who wouldn't fight back, who would be nothing more than puppets for whoever was pulling the strings. "We need to stop them," Keanu said, his voice firm. The room felt colder now, as if the weight of the boy's words had brought a chill into the air. "We need to expose this. To make sure everyone knows what they're doing." The boy gave a slight nod. "That's the plan. But it's not going to be easy. They've covered their tracks well. If we're caught with this, they'll do worse than just silence us. They'll erase us. And anyone who knows about this." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll make sure they don't catch us." The boy turned, glancing at the door. "We don't have much time. We need to find the evidence that'll expose them all. It's here somewhere." They began to scour the room, flipping through more files, pulling out documents, and loading them into Keanu's bag. The weight of each file added to the dread settling in his stomach. They were getting closer, but time was running out. Every minute they spent here was another minute they risked getting caught. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Keanu's heart stopped. The boy's eyes shot to him. "We need to go. Now." They grabbed what they could, the bag now heavier with the evidence they had uncovered. They moved quickly, carefully, but the footsteps were growing louder. The boy glanced over his shoulder one last time, locking eyes with Keanu. "We're not done yet. But we need to get out of here." Keanu nodded, adrenaline rushing through him. There was no turning back now. They had what they came for. And if they didn't get out fast, it would be the last thing they ever did. They bolted toward the exit, the sound of the approaching guards getting closer. But Keanu wasn't going down without a fight. Not now. They burst through the door and into the hall. It was now or never. The hallway stretched out before them, the dim lighting flickering like a warning. Keanu's heart was pounding in his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, to not look back. But the weight of the evidence in his bag reminded him why they couldn't just flee. They had to finish this. They had to expose the truth. "Keep moving," the boy hissed, already several steps ahead. Keanu didn't need any further urging. He pushed himself forward, his breath coming in sharp bursts as they dashed toward the back exit of the building. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, growing into a full sprint as the guards began to chase them. They rounded a corner, and Keanu's eyes scanned the area desperately, searching for an escape route. The boy was a blur of motion, darting into a narrow hallway that led to an emergency exit door. The alarm in the distance screamed, a high-pitched wail that made the hairs on the back of Keanu's neck stand on end. They were trapped in a race against time. "Out the back," the boy shouted, his voice urgent. Keanu didn't need any more instructions. He followed the boy, pushing through a door that led them outside into the cold night air. They were outside now, but the mission was far from over. The facility was still heavily guarded, and the sounds of pursuit were growing closer by the second. The boy didn't slow down as they dashed across the parking lot. Keanu tried to keep up, his mind whirling with thoughts of the danger that loomed behind them and the evidence they now carried. There was no turning back now. The pieces were all there, if they could just make it out of this alive. The boy glanced over his shoulder, his eyes sharp and calculating. "We need a distraction," he muttered. "Something to buy us time." Keanu's mind raced. He spotted a large, old delivery truck parked a few yards away, its engine idling. A perfect opportunity. Without thinking twice, Keanu sprinted toward it, his legs pumping faster than he thought possible. The boy followed closely behind, barely a step behind him. The guards were getting closer now, their voices echoing in the distance. They needed to act quickly. Keanu reached the truck and jumped into the driver's seat, throwing open the door. He didn't know who the truck belonged to, but at this point, he wasn't concerned about details. He just needed it to work. "Get in," he yelled at the boy, who was right behind him, already pulling himself into the passenger seat. Before the boy could ask questions, Keanu slammed the truck into gear and floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, and the tires screeched as they raced across the lot, heading for the exit gates. The guards were still too far behind to stop them immediately, but it wouldn't take long for them to catch up. The boy looked at Keanu, his expression a mix of disbelief and relief. "You really know how to think on your feet, don't you?" Keanu gave him a wry smile. "It's all about improvisation." But they weren't out of danger yet. As they approached the gates, the sound of sirens filled the air. The facility was on full lockdown, and the outside world was about to know what had just happened. Keanu knew they had no time to waste. If they were caught now, it would all be over. He swerved the truck to the right, veering off the main road and onto a dirt path that led into the woods. The truck bounced over the rough terrain, but Keanu kept his foot on the pedal, weaving through the trees as quickly as he could. The boy leaned forward, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "We're not out yet. They'll track us down soon enough." Keanu's eyes darted back to the trail ahead. "We need to get to the city. To the safe house." The boy nodded. "It's the only way." They drove in silence after that, the truck rumbling over the uneven ground as they made their way deeper into the woods. The night felt endless, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. Keanu's mind raced. They had the evidence, but that didn't guarantee safety. They had to get to the safe house, upload everything to the right people, and expose the truth. The whole world needed to know what had been happening in that facility, but that knowledge came with a risk, exposing them. The boy seemed to sense Keanu's unease. He turned to him, his face grave. "It's not going to be easy to make this public. Whoever's behind this, they're powerful. They'll stop at nothing to silence us." Keanu nodded, but something in him had changed. The fear was still there, but it was different now. It was a fuel. It was the fire that kept him moving, kept him focused. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something greater, for the truth. "We'll make them listen," Keanu said, his voice unwavering. The boy looked at him, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You're not like the others." Keanu didn't have an answer to that. He wasn't sure what made him different. Maybe it was the fearlessness that came from knowing there was nothing left to lose. Or maybe it was something deeper, the knowledge that people, innocent people, were counting on them to finish this. Hours passed as they drove through the night. They didn't stop until they reached the safe house, a small, unassuming house at the edge of the city. The boys' safe house. A place where they could finally breathe, if only for a moment. Keanu parked the truck behind the house, out of sight, and they both stepped out into the cool night air. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to peek over the horizon. They didn't speak as they walked to the back of the house, where the boy had a small underground bunker. A place where they could hide, where they could strategize. Inside the bunker, the boy went straight to a set of old computers and began plugging in the files they had stolen. Keanu watched as the boy worked, his fingers flying over the keyboard, opening the documents, transferring them to a secure server. "This is it," the boy said after a long pause. "We're about to change everything." Keanu stood by, watching as the data uploaded, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't know what would happen next. They were in the clear, for now. But there was still so much more to do. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And as the screen finally flashed with confirmation, Keanu knew one thing for sure, the truth was out there now. No matter what came next, there was no turning back. "We did it," Keanu said, looking at the boy. The boy nodded. "We did."